Let me start here and work my way on. Hannah, let me start with you.
All right, so I'm representing Constellar. We are a German-based startup that's developing a satellite constellation for thermal infrared monitoring of primarily agricultural areas. So we measure land surface temperature. Temperature is a very important indicator for health of plants, health of the soil, can be used to determine the right time to irrigate, the right time to fertilize, the right time to harvest plants. And we are building that constellation to help agricultural players to be more sustainable, use less water, because agriculture is a primarily user of fresh water, and it's becoming a more scarce resource, and at the same time limit the use of fertilizer that is not needed. We are differentiating ourselves from available thermal infrared imaging. There are satellites in space that do thermal infrared imaging, but let's say those satellites were not built to give in-field level insights. So the resolution is not good enough to tell an individual farmer how their individual field is doing. They can deliver regional data. And so that's our whole business case, that we deliver data in a higher resolution and also a higher temporal resolution, which means we try to get an image every single day instead of once per week to actually drive action. And happy to talk about a bit that more with the other panelists, but I'll keep that introduction short for now.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much for that. Valeria, let me turn to you now for your perspective. Can you bring us a flavour of the kind of work that the Commission is doing in this area on soil health and data, and the kind of priorities that you see that needs to be done here?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I work in DG Clima, so we are responsible for climate policies, and my unit in particular is responsible for the climate policies for the agriculture and forestry sector. And the way we see it is that, well, these topics are becoming increasingly important because today agriculture represents 12-13% of EU emissions, because the energy, the transport sector, the industry sector are much bigger, but these other sectors are going to decarbonize very quickly. There are very ambitious targets for these sectors, whereas the agricultural sector, as Professor Matthews also showed, is not projected to decrease emissions that much. And so we have to think in the next decade of a situation in which agriculture is actually the largest source of emissions in Europe. And therefore the focus of the climate policy, once the other sectors are almost completely decarbonized, the spotlight will be on agriculture. And if we want to have ambitious and effective climate policies, we need to be better able to monitor what happens. So today the big challenge is, if a member state has a climate target for agriculture, well, as ambitious targets for the agricultural sectors and puts in place measures through the common agricultural policy or through national funds, it's very difficult to see the result, the impact of this policy in the national inventory, because the national inventories are not able to pick up what is happening on the ground. So you may invest a lot of money to give subsidies to farmers to decrease their emissions and not see it in the inventories. So data, to be able to see what happens in the agricultural sector from a climate perspective, will become very, very important. So that's my angle to this session.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that overview. John, let me turn to you now for your perspective. Can you bring us a flavour of the work that you're doing and kind of the perspective that you want to bring to this discussion today?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. The one thing we didn't put in my introduction is I'm a farmer, first and foremost. Mm-hmm. I've had for the last 4 years, I've chaired an EIP operational group funded by the European Commission. And that group of farmers, including my own farm, is on a journey to net zero. And the reason I'm here today is we've done it in a way that's very data rich to actually give integrity to the journey. And when we look at data, actually the first thing we ask before we look at data is, what is the metric that we want to measure to which we get the data from, and why? And it's really important that we spend a bit of time thinking about that. So for me as a farmer, there's several reasons why I want to get my data from particular metrics. One is to make me a better farmer. Okay, so what's the feedback loop? What is it I need to measure that comes back to me, whether it's on emissions, whether it's building carbon stocks, that makes me a better farmer? Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing And it goes back, just a moment ago to your own comments about how does my behavioral change get reported in the Greenhouse Gas National Inventory? How does my behavioral change get reported in Scope 3 emission declarations? And at the moment, one of our challenges about this is that our metrics and data gathering are not at a granularity that picks up individual farmers' behavioral changes. Because as a farmer, I'm not responsible for national inventory, but I am responsible for the net footprint for my business. So I need both data and metrics that are relevant to me, but in a way that I can then show it to the regulator, to the government policy, to report it into national inventory, but also the purchaser of my food, of the product that leaves my farm. So it's really important when we go in this conversation that granularity and resolution is really core of this. And then when we look at this, the connectivity of that data. So we use life cycle assessment calculators. We have a livestock farm. So how do we get different databases to talk to each other? So we've got a cattle movement, for example. When animals are born, they're registered. When animals are sold, they're registered. How do we get that to talk to our life cycle assessment calculator so it's pre-populated? How do I get my soil fertility, my soil carbon stocks loaded into my life cycle calculator so it's pre-populated? So it makes the job of doing my life cycle assessment calculators really easy. And the other area we're looking at is then about governance of the data. Is that what we need, I sit in a working group back at home on, it's called the Food Data Transparency Partnership, where processors are looking for a lot of Scope 3 data, which happens inside the farm gate. But farmers are very nervous of handing their data over because they think it will be misused or abused or used to regulate against them. And so what is the governance we need to put in around this data to make sure, one, that the data is forthcoming, but two, it's only used for what the farmer has given permission to do. And it's really important when we have this data conversation is that we put that governance around it so there's a trust in it. And that trust is two-way. It's so that governments, processors, and concerned society actually know there's an integrity in the journey you're on. And second of all, farmers have the assurance that their data will not be used in a way that they have not given permission for. And so we're looking at third-party, not-for-profits, non-departmental public bodies being the custodian of the data so that they're honest broker rather than all our data going up the supply chain or going to the regulator, is that there is a broker for that, a trusted broker that allows us to go forward on that. So we feel that data is really important. We feel the right metrics are really important, the resolution, the granularity, but we need a governance around that data so that our interests as farmers are protected as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something I hear often from farmers, this nervousness, and it's something I really want to pull a bit out of this conversation as well, something to dig a bit deeper into. So thank you very much for that. Last but not least, Claudia, let me turn to you. Can you explain a little bit about the work that you do and what you're working towards and your association also is working on right now?
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claudia. I work for the Executive Secretariat of the Cut Per Mill Initiative. It's this initiative with all those numbers and letters. We often hear that, so maybe just a quick introduction to what we do. We were launched in Paris in 2015 under the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And we focus to promote or to increase soil health and soil carbon sequestration worldwide in order to mitigate and adaptate to climate change and to foster food security. In that sense, we're a multi-stakeholder platform. Right now we have over 800 members from over 76 or around 80 countries in the network. Amongst those are like 53 governments, national and regional governments. And we operate around a strategic plan, which was elaborated by a lot of experts from the network and covers a whole range of activities, starting from political awareness raising, knowledge sharing, but also project development, mostly multi-stakeholder action at all kinds of levels. What's special about us, like that we have a scientific and technical committee which guides us when we engage in policy processes, but also have a project assessment straight, which is going on. I think in that regard, one of my main points would be that we need a strong dialogue between farmers, policymakers, and researchers. One, in order to see what's technically possible. So, where are we from a point of research of techniques, but also like have the farmers have their say on what is feasible, like what can we actually implement and where can we go, like you need that kind of data, but what can we actually provide you, or what you mentioned, what are we willing to provide to you in that process. And I guess for us as an initiative, we have all different kinds of formats where we try to engage in that process. So we have regional meetings. We just had 3 different regional meetings this year where we brought together all stakeholders discussing not only on data, but also on data and MRV. Maybe one interesting thing we're engaged at right now is a study employed by the Deloitte consultancy, which focuses on a compilation of MRV systems and tools, which can finally result in an online tool, which is kind of a decision support tool for different kind of stakeholders. So, what kind of information do I need and how do I get there? What kind of a system could be helpful to do that? Maybe just three very brief points which I took away from the last meetings we had. We said, it's important to foster the dialogue between the different stakeholders, but then it's also, it's important to invest in the creation of MRV systems based on the data we have available right now. So how can we combine the different data collection mechanisms which are out there? And at the moment, from what we heard from people like Keith Poshton, Pete Smith, is that like the most feasible way is actually to really have a combined approach of on-the-ground data, remote sensing data, and modeling. At the same time, we have to put effort into the development of on-the-ground measurement techniques. So how can we improve the accuracy, not only to map the soil we have, but also to get there that we can detect small changes in carbon stocks, which at the moment still is quite tricky, even if there are really promising developments. And then maybe as a last point, still I guess we should not forget basic research, because even if we know a lot about soils, there's still a lot we don't know, especially when it comes to cause-effect relationships of the measures which are implemented, which in the end, if we have a better understanding of what's going on the ground, can help us to maybe even reduce the amount of data we need to measure, because we measure the right data and we measure what we need to know in order to help the farmers decide on where they want to go, but also to inform society on what farmers are actually doing, which of course in the end helps the farmer to build a business case. Maybe so much for now.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this overview. Just before we dig into the discussion a bit more, I will remind everyone to submit your questions if you have any on Slido via the hashtag that you can see on the screen, FutureFood23. So if you do have questions, don't be shy, do put them to our panellists, and I hope to have enough time at the end to put them to our panellists. So lots of different themes being pulled out here. I think I will start, let's start at maybe a broader question about the kind of data that maybe I'll turn to you first, Hannah. What kind of data do you see is necessary to shift this behavior, to encourage this behavioral change that we need? And what technologies do you see that can bring us this technology that exists now? And what, maybe you can expand a little bit. I know you already spoke a bit about the work that you do, but can you expand a little bit there for us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, our company has decided on a very specific measure, and that is land surface temperature. Land surface temperature can measure something direct, but also is an indicator for a few other things that can happen in an agricultural field. One of the direct measurements is, for example, if a plant is under water stress, it doesn't have enough water from the soil to sustain its internal functions, it stops the transpiration of water from their leaves. It's a bit similar to humans. They regulate the temperature through transpiration. And when they stop that process, the surface temperature of the leaves changes. It rises because the sun's shining on the leaf and there is no water that would cool it down. And that we can measure directly with a land surface temperature measurement. So we can tell that this field is too dry because it is hotter than the field next to it that has been watered, for example. So that's a direct measurement. And then more indirect, it can be an indicator for the health of the soil. There was a study in France where a regenerative agricultural field was on average on a hot summer day 2 degrees cooler than a field that was with conventional agriculture, because the soil can absorb more water, can hold onto it longer, and thus the whole ecosystem of that field is cooler. So that's like 2 of the examples of a direct and indirect measurement. So with our data, we can give indications, but we can also give farmers an action plan. We can tell them this field is watered enough, you don't need to do anything, and this field is under water stress, you need to water it, and otherwise you will have a yield loss. So it's those kinds of data that need to be actionable to change anything. It's difficult in the beginning to get to the individual farmer. That's why initially we're currently talking to agri-tech companies of how can we get our data into their digital farm management systems. But we're obviously hoping also that our data actually is something that farmers are interested in themselves to be used, and there maybe the regulator comes in as well. If that data is recognized as being an indicator for a specific thing, that is then very clear, as John also pointed out, a benefit for the farmer. So it's, again, collaboration and cooperation between governments, private companies, and the ecosystem as a whole.
And so maybe on that point, it's a logical step to come to you. Maybe I'll put the same question to you, because I was also thinking maybe a bit more widely. You're thinking about the kind of data that you see is necessary to shift behavior, thinking here of Copernicus, things like this, but also maybe to react on what Hannah just said here. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and reflections there.
No, we are very passionate about all these satellite-based solutions. So, of course, there is a Copernicus program of the European Union, which will be fundamental for improving our understanding of what happens on the land. So let's say that at the big scheme at the big level of having a national or a European overview of what happens on the land, we have several frameworks. So there's the framework, the regulation on land use change and forestry, LULUCF, which sets very ambitious targets for the capacity of our land sector to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. There is a target for the whole EU that the LULUCF sector should sequester 310 million tons of CO2 by 2030, and this is divided into national targets. So this is a main thing of the LULUCF regulation, but also as important, there are also requirements for member states to improve their reporting of emissions and removals from the land sector, and in that context, we need to rely a lot on satellite imagery, because we don't really need to know the statistics of how many hectares are under cropland, how many hectares are under forest. We need to know where these land uses happen, because we need to know if there is a land use change from cropland to forest. You need to see it in a map to understand its overall impact for climate. So we call them geographically explicit databases, and for this we need the satellite imagery. And then there is the recent proposal for the soil monitoring law. This is a DG environment policy, but of course very relevant for us as well, because that also sets out a framework for member states to create better governance for data about the soils. And very soon we will adopt a proposal for a forest monitoring law. So the vision is that with all these national systems to collect better data on the land sector and on agriculture, we arrive at the next CAP and also the next round of climate policies after 2030 in a situation where we can really take action at the individual level, and this action is recognized and seen in the national inventories. And so that leads me to the individual level, so that we also want to address, because one thing is giving targets at the national level, one thing is giving incentives directly to farmers and foresters and landowners. So in that perspective, we proposed 1 year ago a framework for the certification of carbon removals, which is now in co-decision. Hopefully it will become a law before the next elections, and we think with the progress in Parliament and Council, we are getting there. And in that context, we want to establish harmonized methodologies to certify carbon removals in the land sector, in the soils, in the forests. Soils means also organic soils, so peatlands, which are a very important carbon stock. So we created an expert group in the spirit of listening to the experts and making everybody talk together and finding the best compromise between scientists and people on the ground. So we created this expert group that is advising us on methodologies for the certification of carbon removals. So that's a big part of our work right now. So it's when it comes to the accuracy, the trade-off between accuracy and costs, basically, and affordability for farmer and for the forester, all these digital technologies, we mentioned satellite-based imagery, but also artificial intelligence, machine learning, they're all very important to drive down the costs and make all this data available to the farmer, and that the farmer gets this data, doesn't need to compute it themselves. These are very, very important to unlock all these systems.
I can see that you wanted to come in on this point. You had a reaction.
Because as a practitioner and
Yes.
as someone who's taking 7 farms on a journey, we're concerned that actually there isn't enough granularity in that. We actually believe, as a farmer, measurement is good. So all our farms have been measured to 1 meter in depth. And we measure our soil organic carbon and our bulk densities, 0 to 15 centimeters, 50 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 and beyond. And we do it with a resolution. Our plan is to come back every 5 years and repeat it. So if we switch, so we're predominantly livestock agriculture, we're a monoculture of perennial ryegrass. We're trying to get farmers to switch to more legumes and herbs, so a more regenerative approach. And what happens when you do that is those roots are deeper and they lay down more carbon and deeper. So you need a tool to measure that. Satellites won't do that. So we put boots in the ground, we've got a piece of kit, and we've got a company now that in 3 years has dropped the price by 80%, okay? We've also then switched to aerial LiDAR technology, where we're scanning the landscape at 40 scans per square meter. So it's allowing us, and again, our plan is to repeat it every 5 years, because what we don't know, and one of the things I learned, there was a paper published by Wageningen University Research in June, is it is a challenge to model change in carbon stocks in soil, okay? And we believe the best way, until we get enough data, is to measure and manage, measure and manage. So the mixture of the LiDAR is fantastic for above ground carbon, and then there's forensic going down to 1 meter, and we're doing probably on average 4 samples per hectare across the whole farm. So what our 7 farms have got, and this was all funded by the EIP operational working groups, okay, is we now have a carbon asset register on our farms. So we know where all the carbon is and where it's not. So now we're saying, well, in 5 years' time, so on my farm, I have 24,400 tons of carbon in my farm. I'm hoping in 5 years' time I'll have 26,000 tons. So just like we're setting targets to reduce emissions, we're now setting targets in building carbon stocks. So now from this is a really useful piece of equipment and tool, is I now know where my carbon stocks are, and I can focus in the poor bits. Those are the bits I can maybe change, I'm not necessarily changing my land use, but I'm changing my land management, okay? So I'm correcting my soil pH. I'm putting in diversity. I'm using manures better. I'm using grazing animals better in their feces. And I'm using that. I'm looking at more silver pasture rather than just a monoculture of grass or a monoculture of trees. But the great thing with this forensic approach is that as I change my behavior, as we go back and remeasure every 5 years, I see the consequence of my behavioral change. And really what farmers are pleading for is, can we have that kind of resolution? So as many people know, I'm from Northern Ireland. We've now approached our government, and we've now got our government to invest £45 million to baseline every field, every tree, every hedge, and to give that data back to farms, and to repeat it every 5 years. But also to use the technology for other things, because what went through the European Parliament Environment Committee on Tuesday was they were very supportive of the carbon removals framework, but they're saying, but we want you to deliver other public goods as well. So in our case, we've used our LiDAR data along with our soil fertility, to create runoff risk maps, because we have a real problem with water quality. So this emerging of these digital data, and because it's all digital, you can layer them, and then you can vertically look down, and you look at then improving water quality, looking at increasing habitat connectivity. If you want to look at birds and bees, actually have habitats that connect to each other, really important. So we would like actually to go further. We want this granularity. We believe it's the farmer's friend, is that we can then use it to prove our train has left the station. We are facing our responsibilities, but we want it measured with a sophistication. When I hand it back to Valeria, you can then put it in, the greenhouse gas national inventory. You can be, assured that there's a journey of integrity. From a farmer's point of view, they get the signal. If I change my behavior this way, that works. If I change it this way, that doesn't work. So you can really focus and leverage what works best on what landscape with what soil type.
I think there you obviously made a very compelling case for this need for granularity and how that can encourage more climate positive farming. I'm just wondering, and I will come to you afterwards, Claudia, but I'm just wondering on that point, there is also a balance between this granularity and this precision and also the simplicity and the access for farmers, right? Because it does sound like there's a quite complex layering, lots of data. Just wondering
my problem with simplicity is it averages. And the problem with an average, if you've got a pioneer or an early adopter facing their responsibilities, you're averaged with the people who have done nothing. And it's really frustrating. There is no incentive for a good farmer to change their behavior if they're going to be averaged. So actually, the appeal from farmers who want a future is, can we go to what we call tier 3 factors, so that we're actually using actual farm data. And we've negotiated with our government that measuring, reporting and verification is a public good. So the government, it's up to us to change our behavior, but they've come forward with one system, just like the framework is looking at one system. They've come forward with one system, and they're going to repeat it every 5 years and put that information then back to the farmers. So there's this feedback loop, okay? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about compliance. Rome is burning today, philosophically. If we don't change our behavior, Rome will have burnt in 5 or 10 years' time. And it's really important that we start the behavioral change now, and that land managers and farmers like me get that feedback loop, and it needs to be accurate. It really needs to be accurate. It also is a great tool then for citizen engagement, to bring wider society onto farms and look how we're doing it and think, wow, okay. And it just so happens when you do this, on 7 of our farms, 3 of our farms are beyond net zero today, and they're all livestock farms. And the concept of livestock farms being beyond net zero, nobody's talking about. Of the 7 we've done, 3 are beyond net zero today.
Okay. Claudia, let me bring... There's an appreciative in the audience. Claudia, let me bring you in on this point of granularity. I mean, how do you see that we can achieve this granularity that John is saying that we need, more granular data, and how do you see this encouraging climate positive farm management, but while also balancing with this accessibility for farmers and the usability? What are your thoughts there? Do you have anything to add to the flavors to the discussion we've already had?
That's a tricky question. Well, I guess one question which is in there as well for me is what kind of data do we really need? I mean, I think there's a difference if we want to enter involuntary carbon markets, for example, where it's really, really important to measure even small changes, because in the end it will be for the good or the worst of all if we miscalculate those changes. Or do we just show general trends? Do we want to say, hey, this farm enterprise is on a good way moving forward? Then maybe the third position after the comma is not as important. And then I guess for me it's also a question of who's collecting the data. You mentioned who's owning the data, okay. And what kind of data is already collected anyway at farm level. And I think these modeling approaches, which were also looked at closer under the Sarkassa project, for example, they try to do that. They try to build on management data which is collected by farmers anyway, to combine that with long-term experiences from long-term studies, so like causal relations we know, which you can then feed into the models, and to have like certain points for ground truthing, but not to put the entire burden of ground truthing to the different farmers. And I know it's a big discussion, and I guess there's no universal answer to that now. Maybe just a teaser, we will have actually a webinar of our science committee on that on the 27th of November, focusing exactly on that question, like, where should we focus on? Like, is it really only the on-the-ground measurement, or is it like this bigger approaches which then just, which is not applied by single farmers anymore? So the single farmers feed in the data, but like the modeling work, like that's a burden we cannot put on the individuals to reach a conclusion.
In Ireland, we're about to face a cull of dairy cows. You know, it is proposed that 200,000 dairy cows will be culled next year.
Yeah.
200,000 dairy cows will be culled the following year. The emotion that is going to send through the farming community. The response from the farming community is, I want my own data, because I actually want to stand up and say, I've put my house in order. And I think this is going quicker than a lot of people think, because we've already seen what's going on in Netherlands, and now it's happening in the Republic of Ireland, is that farmers are not going to take it lying down, their animals being taken away and culled, okay? They will do everything in their power. They have a love for them, and they will do everything in their power. So they want this resolution. They want to prove they can get emissions down, and they can get carbon stocks up, they can put some renewables in, they can do some waste management, and they can deliver net zero. And the pertinence of this conversation is really important when there are countries now that are going to go to the stage of a national cull, okay? And that is really focusing the emotion. In today's Irish Farmers Journal, the headline is about the decision in the European Parliament's Environment Committee on Tuesday. It was also talking about the Australian framework. There's a thing called the Clean Air Regulator in Australia, and what they're doing, and why aren't we looking at this and accelerating this?
Okay, well, Valeria, let me bring you in now then. You've heard the, the calls from the farmers on the granularity and the balancing of this and what you were speaking about before. Do you have any reflections on what we've just heard here from the panelists and from the farmers' perspective?
Yeah, so we speak often to people like Professor Gilliland and farmers, but also technology providers who tell us that the costs of the sampling techniques and all these models is really going down very quickly.
Correct.
So I have a lot of hope for the research community to come up with solutions that can make this data availability less costly. Because only 3 years ago, when we started looking into the carbon farming concept, the cost of MRV was the #1 barrier. But then when you hear what amazing technologies are being found out now, it seems that this can be done. I just have a doubt, because I think you talked to these 7 farms who are very passionate, and I just wonder whether this will apply to the millions of farmers who, in the European Union, in different parts of the European Union, not only in Ireland, who may see this as a big burden.
Well, that's the big win we had with the Belfast government, is that the government has stepped in to fund this. It's 3%. Okay. So just to put it into costs, of the total subvention that comes to Northern Ireland agriculture, the measuring, reporting and verification, with LiDAR and soil sampling is 3%. Look, it's costing us 45 million over 4 years. It's 11 million, and it works out at £56 per hectare every 5 years. So that's our cost.
This is very interesting, because in the end, it's also in the government's interest to invest. It's an investment.
And it's interesting. So on the island down, we have a divergence of views between Dublin and Belfast. Dublin are talking about culling. Belfast are talking about getting farmer behavioural change. Yeah. And we're going, in Northern Ireland, we're going down the data route. We're using all these metrics, go out and measure, and we're so government has stepped in to fund this, because we believe it's about empowering farmers to be better farmers. Not telling them, talking with them, not talking at them, and actually getting them to change their behaviour. Because we all need to get to net zero by 2050. And it's really important there's a just transition to get the farming community and land managers through this journey, so they're still there managing that land, feeding us. you know? So it's really important to keep them on board through this process.
To conclude,
Yeah,
it's a very attractive proposition, I think, from a policymaker point of view, because in 2021 we published a communication called the Sustainable Carbon Cycles Communication. This was a bit where we published the action plan that included the certification framework, but also other policies in the field of carbon removals and carbon capture and use. And there one of our aspirational goals was that by 2028 all farmers should have access to the data they need to calculate their climate footprint. And that was really, 2028 was the year of the next Common Agricultural Policy. So I think with the speed, the rate of technological progress we see, it's not such an impossible task that by 2028 farmers do not only know how much feed they buy, how much carcass volume they produce, but also how much carbon they produce. Yeah. There may be different views about the commodification of carbon, but it is something that is measurable, which is unfortunately not the case for other public goods like biodiversity, water quality. That is more challenging. But for carbon, we have tools to quantify, and if we can make that a factor in the decision of the farmer, that can see it also as a source of income or something that becomes a business model, hopefully it's not only a burden on him, but something that is incentivized to do. But I completely agree that the MRV costs should be supported, borne by the public sector. Yeah. So it's a nice proposition. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe an inspiration for your future thinking there in that capacity. Okay, so I now want to draw on another theme that John raised, and that's this issue of trust building with farmers and trying to help them, I suppose, to understand how their data is going to be used and stored, and the ownership. That you said there was a nervousness. Hannah, perhaps I can bring you in. Do you have any reflections there about how best to reassure farmers, maybe from your experience of or from your work there, having that connection with farmers, helping them understand exactly what this data will do and how it will help, and also trying to address this trust issue. I hear this a lot from farmers, so it's something that I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts on.
I mean, I'm not sure I can directly comment on John's point, because the data we're creating is not, let's say, data that the farmer owns as such. We measure the surface temperature of the Earth, wherever a satellite flies indiscriminately over the surface of the Earth. So there is, let's say, we're not unveiling any secrets or any particular activities that the farmer does necessarily. We give indications on how the soil looks like, what the temperature is, etc. So when it comes, let's say, to the privacy concerns of what the data is used for, we're not necessarily in that data, or I wouldn't see it as a data that the farmer would necessarily be concerned about having been publicized, because that's how they handle their animals, that's how they handle their soil and etc. So the only thing that I can say, we are on the way of becoming a Copernicus contributing mission. The European Commission has launched a new project in which emerging data suppliers like us get funding for a specific amount of years to prepare to become a Copernicus contributing mission. So our data will contribute to that stock of data and can flow into the Copernicus services. Obviously has its challenges as well. Our data is new. The services have to figure out what they can do with it, and if there will maybe even be a new service instead of just flowing into an existing services. There's a question of budgeting and so on. But we do have the data that we generate, and the data that we use has to be very secure for that. So we have regulations about data access, data security, how we handle data within our company. So maybe it's not directly the point that John raised, but let's say that's our view on data security.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps, Claudia, I can also bring you on a similar point from your experience. I mean, how do you think we can work to build this trust with farmers about the use of data, this nervousness that John raised? Do you have any reflections to add on this point?
Well, I guess one of the most important things you already raised before actually is that you that the data also benefits the farmers themselves, so that it's not only like a duty they have to fulfill, but that you make sure like that the data you collect and the range of data you collect, you know, maybe because that's one point I actually wanted to add before. For me, it has to go beyond carbon stocks in the soil. So looking at biological indicators, for example, which are not well understood, so it's difficult to include them, but still it's important to move also in that direction. But that's just one example, but to really make sure that the data we collect gives a picture of what's happening on the farm and in the landscape as a whole. And I think that, well, will benefit the farmer and might also take out some concerns. And then, I mean, you can find different models of, you know, like how putting regulations on what the data can be used, who has access to the data, some kind of randomization, but then it's also getting tricky at the point where you where you're not able to allocate the data to a certain farm anymore, which protects the privacy of the farmer. I guess for greenhouse gas reporting, it's fine, but if a farmer wants to build a business case, there's maybe also some trade-offs you have to agree to, like concerning your data.
Yeah, John, you want to come in on this
So,
point?
our trick around this, and remember, if we're talking about Scope 3 emission declarations, 80% of the raw material that's going to be processed, most of that footprint will sit within the farm gate. So we have to find a solution for this if we're going to help the greenhouse gas protocol and all those corporations out there making Scope 3 declarations. What we did with the Northern Ireland Soil Nutrient Health Scheme is that the government is funding it, so the data belongs to the government. But the government can't get onto the land without the farmer's permission. Because this isn't just about aerial LiDAR. This is physically going out, putting boots on the ground and taking samples, okay? And we did not only carbon stocks, but we did fertility and we did water quality as well. So we wanted to go beyond just carbon, that this is a complete package, okay, as such. And the deal that was brokered is that the data would rest within a non-departmental public body. Okay, so it's still controlled by the public. It will not be used for regulation. All the data that's lifted off your farm will come back to you, but in a way that's really communicable. So you get maps, not spreadsheets. You know, you get runoff risk maps. You get LiDAR images. Where is your above ground biomass? Where is it not? And it's really visual, and that really helps the behavioral change. What the regulator gets is a communized set of data then. So if we're looking at catchment solutions for water quality, you actually want to know what is the nutrient loading in that catchment. So you can model then what is it I need to do. What the farmer gets in that is they get their routes of runoff, is so they then can prioritize. And so when they then apply for environmental farming schemes, they will now use their data in their application. I want to put a woody riparian strip there because my runoff risk map says that's where I'm most exposed. Okay? So that you show cause and effect, cause and effect. And so when we come back in 5 years' time and we really do it again, we can see the woody riparian strip growing. Okay? So we can prove then to the auditors that this money that's gone into this sector actually is leveraging the behavioral change and we're getting the wins out of it. But the key in that was the undertaking from the minister is that the data would not be used for regulation. That all the data lifted on the farm would go back because the farm, you know, there has to be something in it for them. It can't just be about compliance. The whole concept is we're giving this back because we believe our future is in your hands. So we're going to give you information and we're going to give you training around it. So they can build a soil nutrient health, they can build a nutrient management plan. They can build a plan then about how to build carbon stocks, how to get better connectivity in habitats, how to improve water quality. So it's a whole package. And it's only enabled because we now got digitalization. And it's these layers of data, all done on GIS frameworks, all layered on top, that allows us to talk to each other and get the multiple wins. And when you read the carbon removals framework, one of the key things is how do you, it's more than just carbon, you know, and how do you get the other multiple wins? So this is on 800,000 hectares. So this is the scale that this is now going forward. The Arc Zero project is just beyond it. We've gone further in soil carbon, and we've gone further in behavioural change. We're about 3 years in front of it. We were the pilot. That's what EIP operational groups are. We're the pilot, and we fed it back into policy, and now we've got policy supporting us, which is, you know, credit to the European Commission. That's what EIP operational groups were funded to do.
Claudia, did you want to come in on this point?
Yeah,
I saw a little hand. Yeah.
Just very briefly, because I think you mentioned a very important point there. It's not only about the collection of the data, it's also about enabling the users, whoever it might be, how to use it and how to interpret the data in the end. So I guess investment is also needed in capacity building, and we have to ask ourselves, like, is every farmer supposed to work in a multi-layer GIS system? Can we expect that from the farmers? Or how can we make sure that they have the support and the expertise they need outside of their farm as well?
92% of Northern Irish farmers have signed up. 92%. We're doing it over 4 years, 2 years into it, and of the 2 zones, which is half of Northern Ireland, 92% farmers. Now, our College Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise is doing the whole digitalisation of training. They all are getting individual packs because it's really important, and we've got different levels of expertise. But you know, I've sat through, because I've been a driver for it. I chaired the expert working group that wrote it, and so I've been watching some of the training sessions. And some people really get onto it really easy, some don't. And there's also an age issue there, because the younger people love it. You know, people my age or older, you know. But the way we've done it, yes, they do get a spreadsheet because they get their raw data, but they get these extraordinary colour maps. And most people, actually, when they look down, the colour maps, and particularly the LiDAR ones, are really impactful. And even if you're not IT savvy, the maps are really, really impactful.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, you know, how you present the data and how you communicate that. Valeria, I wanted to bring you in on this point of, you know, trust building with farmers, but also I suppose the question now Claudia has raised also about how you can ensure that there are the advisory services that go along with these technologies, that there is this expertise, this training, just as John was saying, you know, for all farmers, young, old, everyone in between. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on both of those points that are raised.
Yeah, so in the context of preparing and now negotiating the carbon removal certification framework, we spoke a lot with these companies. I asked them, what is the name of the type of business you do? And I always get different answers, but basically they're intermediaries between the farmers and the certification bodies or the certification schemes. They group farmers together, and they provide services for them to understand better how to access certification services. It's not only advisory, that's very important. They do advisory, which is very important, but it's also pooling the risks. So if instead of being a single farmer certifying your farm for its climate footprint, you do it jointly with a group of farmers. If at some point there are some events outside of your control, climatic weather events that cause a release of the carbon, if you have grouped with other farmers, you can share this risk. So usually these companies, they also take away a buffer from all the carbon that goes into these registries, and it keeps it away in case of natural disturbances or this carbon release. So these groups, in the regulation, they're called groups of operators. It doesn't sound very sexy, but this is what we mean. So you have these companies providing these services, and we think it's quite an important business model. I also hear many startups funded by EIT and in this kind of business. I guess in some way your company can belong to that universe of startup companies, helping farmers to get access to the certification services, and thereby giving them a lot of information, not only about their current climate impact, but also about the pathway, the best way to improve their climate performance in the future. So we really hope that we are kind of creating a market which is happening anyway, but we are trying to maybe consolidate it around more harmonized methodologies, because now it's a bit of a wild west where everyone is proposing different methodologies, and we really believe that with one harmonized certification methodology at the EU level, this will just give a push to this type of businesses that are also helpful for the farmers.
Okay, we do have a few questions from the audience, but maybe I'll just turn to you quickly, Hannah, before. Do you have anything to react to what we've heard so far? Anything to add to any of the reflections we've had here?
Not directly, maybe. Let's say our main business case is not necessarily in carbon. We can give indications of soil health, but obviously no satellite system can measure carbon in the soil. And anybody who claims otherwise is probably not quite correct. At least that's what our remote sensing specialists will argue against. We can't measure carbon from space. So satellite imagery is something that's complementary. It can never get the granularity, or current technology cannot get the granularity of, let's say, a soil sample that what you're measuring. We can just give indications, we can observe, we can monitor, and we can do it more cheaply than if you would have something in situ measurements, for example. Theoretically, you could measure temperature also on the ground, but you would need a lot of probes in the ground to do the same granularity that we can deliver from space. So it's just a very complementary part of the whole system and the whole story of how do we measure, let's say, climate change, how do we see the impacts of climate change, and how can we try to address them overall.
One of the, Hannah and I have been talking about, one of the great things about Hannah's technology is if you have, the soil temperature and you have the soil moisture, it's a fantastic tool then to help me when I spread my fertilizer and my farmyard manure. Because, one of the biggest, everyone talks about methane, but nitrous oxide is a long-lived gas. It's 260 times more global warming potential as such. So actually, Hannah's data is fantastic for me on my route to net zero, because it allows me then to make better decisions. When do I spread my manures? When do I spread my fertilizer? I spread it when the soil is warm and dry, okay? Because I know that will minimize my nitrous oxide emissions. Where I come from, Ireland, we have a lot of wet soils. And our wet soils, we turn it into nitrous oxide really quickly, and up it goes. So, okay, it may not help me measure my carbon stocks, but it will absolutely help me do something else, and that is to minimize my nitrous oxide emissions.
Okay, let me take a couple of questions from the audience here. I've got a question come in. I'm not sure who maybe is best placed. Perhaps you can just jump in if you'd like to respond to this question. The question, it doesn't say who it's from, but the question is, are there potential issues with software lock-in and interoperability, mirroring dependencies on private sector for other inputs? Would anybody like to come in on this point? We're avoiding eye contact, or you?
Well,
you'd like to come in?
This is a really relevant question. So all our farms have gone through a life cycle assessment calculator. If you've ever done it, it's really tedious, okay? And you have to go and collect a whole heap of different data of all different inputs, and you have to put it in. It's so tedious at the moment that certainly we're only doing it now once every 3 years. If we were doing it every year, I can tell you my fathers and farmers and myself will say, hell, no way, okay? So what we do need, there are already other sources of information out there. Our typical one in our part of the world is animal movements. Animal movements are really important because if you're doing your life cycle assessment, you want to know what animals were on your farm, when were they born, when did they leave, when were they slaughtered. That's all part of the calculation. Now, so that's held in a public database, but can we get the two to talk to each other so that you pre-populate? So when the farmer comes along, as much of the publicly available data is harvested and mined, okay, and brought into that life cycle assessment calculator. So you make the job of doing the life cycle assessment calculator far less onerous. We were talking this morning, how do we make the right thing the easy thing to do? Well, the right thing is people do life cycle assessment calculators. At the moment, there's nothing easy about them. They're really tedious, they're a real pain. So actually getting different databases to talk to each other and bring it forward to life is really important. And there are barriers there. There are technological barriers, but there's IP barriers, and we have to, that's part of the governance of data, and those, so we do need to drill into that and look at that. It's a really good question.
Is anybody else like to come in on this point? You don't look very sure. Would you like to come in on this point about software locking and?
Well, I just have the impression that indeed there are so many different calculation tools, so many different pieces of software, That was one of the reasons why we thought a harmonized certification methodology and a harmonized system would help. In terms of interoperability, in our proposal, we had the idea that you could still have different certification schemes, each with its own registry, but these registries should be interoperable, and we were willing to work on the rules to make these registries interoperable. But now I hear from both Council and the Parliament the willingness to give us the whole job to just do one EU registry, which would be for carbon removal certified units, which would be a challenge, but okay, if the legislators tell us we have to, we will try to find a way. So in that sense, the interoperability will not be as important. But I'm talking now once the units are already certified and put on a registry. And the main point of this registry, this unified registry, is to avoid double counting, so or double claiming, so to avoid that the same unit is sold to two different buyers or used in two different ways. So that's the main level I'm talking about. I think the question was more about actually the farmer inputting data in these tools. And for that, we still have to discuss with the expert group whether it makes sense to have a unified software tool or interoperable tools. These are all questions that are very difficult, and we need our experts to advise us, yes.
Okay, and we do, oh sorry, yes.
I could do a very quick comment, just let's say on software and IP in general. There's always going to be part of software that for a commercial company will be part of their IP, because there's something very specific. But there's also lots of movement in general in these areas of open software, open source, open data, that is realized that if you make certain parts of it public and open, it benefits you as well. There is sometimes also, we have one of a project where we will develop something software related, and part of getting it funded by a public body is to make it open source. So there's those kinds of things that maybe can help with these things. And then how you then interact with different tools. I mean, yeah, you will develop an API to be able to exchange data in between. So maybe that was just like a small comment on the side on like open source and open data.
Did you want to come in on this point? I could see.
Just briefly, because I think like what's also important is that, I mean, are we looking at the parameters? So, you know, like if we talk about comparability and we have one indicator, we also have to look at the methodology, how we got to that indicator. And like when we talk about harmonization, I think that's a very important point, and I know the EU is also working on it, so to harmonize lab procedures, for example, so to really understand how did we get to the data, because maybe the same parameter might be derived in a completely different way, and then it gives you a different result, and you cannot compare those anymore. So the level of detail when we talk about comparability is really important, just to bring that in as well.
Okay, and unless there's any other questions, if you do have questions, get them in now, because we're coming to the end of our session, so I'm just heaping on a bit of pressure there for anyone that has any other questions. There was another question, of course, I think we've potentially covered this, but the question's for you, John. It says, we've spoken about this, but what life cycle assessment tools can you recommend to use? And as you said, obviously it's very complicated, but perhaps was there anything else you could elaborate on at all?
I'm asked this question on a regular basis, and what I ask people who ask me the question, I'm guilty, I answer the question with a set of questions.
Oh, okay.
Okay, the first question is, so, I know in Northern Ireland I can access 40 different tools, okay? And that's bonkers, okay? And they all give you different answers for the same data.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
Okay, so the first question I ask is, are they independent? Okay, because the only reason I'm doing this is I want to use my result to explain my journey. So, is it independent? Okay? Not someone who's going to buy your carbon, because I don't believe they're independent. Okay? So, is it independent? That's the first thing. The second thing, are they accredited? Calculators should be accredited to an ISO standard, and in the UK, there's a PAS 2050 standard as well. So are they accredited? So those are the first two questions. The third question we ask is, will they look at the totality of the farm business and not just one product? Because when you go on this journey, most farms do not produce one product. They could produce half a dozen or a dozen products. And so something Valeria said earlier on is making sure nothing gets double counted or nothing gets left out. So it's really important when you go in is you do the totality, your calculator can do the totality of the business, okay? The next question we ask is, if they can do all that, the next thing is, can they do carbon sequestration, okay? So our greenhouse gas emissions are to what they call tier 2 emissions. Carbon sequestration is only to tier 1 at the moment. We want to get it to tier 3. So can they do that? Because we want to talk about net carbon. Because net zero is not about gross zero, it's about net zero. Okay, and it's really important we understand that. So can they do that? And the two last questions is that there's a question out there IPCC are debating at the moment. Is methane a short-lived gas? Okay? We currently use what they call global warming potential 100 as the methodology. There is a second methodology that Oxford University is proposing called GWP star. There's a recent paper published in the UK that 9 of the top UK scientists have now signed off on, is to say that GWP star is the right thing for biogenic methane from livestock farms. Okay. But they recognize that IPCC are deliberating, okay? So their recommendation is please present your journey to both GWP 100 and GWP star. So the ARC Zero work I presented at the United Nations and the European Animal Science Conference 6 weeks ago to both methodologies, okay? It's really interesting to see, and it really highlights that we have to answer the question, is methane a short-lived gas, and what is the right methodology about it? And the last question, because we're all on a journey here, we're all learning, is whatever your calculator provider, are they backed by a credible science-based organization? Because we're on a journey, we learn new things every day about it, we get more data. We need a science rigor behind that. So those are 6 questions, and when you put 40 calculators through those 6 questions, certainly in Northern Ireland, there's probably 1 at a push, 2 calculators that come out top. And we have used a calculator called AgriCalc from SRUC. It's an organization the Commission knows well. They've done a lot of research for the European Commission. And they are the most, for us, they fulfilled those 6 questions best. And that's how we picked our calculator. Okay. Because it is a Wild West out there. And so we need to have rigor on this. And they are completely independent. So when I stand up and present the work of my EIP operational group, I can do it with integrity. And, you know, and everyone can see the transparency that we've gone through in the process. We know that the science of methane will continue to evolve, okay? We have, even a GWP star, I don't believe that is fully bottomed out, even if IPC pick it. You know, I think we will continue to do methane research. Methane is different to nitrous oxide and CO2.
Okay.
It's really important because when you do this and you look at the data, when you look at GWP star, suddenly we're not talking about methane anymore, we're talking about nitrous oxide. And I just think the public debate has focused too much on methane and not enough on nitrous oxide. It is a long-lived gas. Its global warming potential is 270 times against methane at 26 times. And we need to focus on what is the real problem. And we've got a tool in our toolbox called legumes. And legumes are fantastic to taking nitrogen out of the sky and putting it under the soil. And we need to get, and that's regenerative agriculture.
Well, I think that's a very good, comprehensive, I hope that helps the person in the audience who wanted to know about the tools. Also lots of acronyms. We're used to that in Brussels. Plenty of acronyms there. Okay, we've got around about 8 minutes left, something like that, of our panel. I thought, as there's no more questions coming in from the audience, I thought what we could do is maybe, as a concluding remark, maybe a quick whip round of, I know it's a little bit hard to, you know, kind of boil it down to one, but perhaps thinking of, you know, one main recommendation from your perspective you would offer to policymakers. Obviously, I will skip out the policymaker and maybe then come back to you at the end and hear your reflections about what we've heard. So perhaps I can start here with you, Hannah. Do you have, you know, what would be your main message? This is your moment. What would be your main message to policymakers, something you really would like to see?
I mean, in the end, we're data providers, and we want our data to be used, and we want our data to make a difference. And so we will have commercial customers, we'll sell that data to commercial customers, but we also want the policymakers to use our data and to certify our data and say our data is useful to do this and this and that we're on the journey to be there. As said, the Copernicus contributing mission, that there is other ways in which our data could be used in public policy. And we're an impact-driven startup. We want to make a positive change in the world. Our founders it's really, really important to them as well. So the more data is used to make a difference, the better it is. So we want to deliver data to anyone who wants it and who can use it and make a difference as well. We are a commercial company. At some point, somebody has to pay for it as well, but that's a different discussion in the end.
Okay, excellent, great. I will come to you, John, now for what would be your main take-home message for policymakers?
So my plea is that we get a granularity that actually picks up actual behavioral change, because averaging and modeling does not give the feedback signal enough to get the behavioral change that we need. Mm-hmm. And that is a public good. The measuring, reporting, and verification. The behavioral change is up to us as farmers, but the measuring, reporting, and verification to one standard, one framework, so it has integrity, is a public good. And that's where government steps in to help us, is to actually help us be better farmers. Mm-hmm. We are fed up being a pariah. I'm a livestock farmer. We are the worst people in the world, according to my grandchildren's school teacher. And that's really hurtful. And actually, when you look at our biodiversity under our soils with grass, where the cow feces is actually driving our soil biology, actually, my ruminant feces is absolutely key to driving biodiversity. And remember, over 60% of the world's biodiversity is in the soil. Mm-hmm. It is not in the sky.
Okay, thank you for that. And Claudia, lastly, what would be your main policy recommendations for policymakers listening to this panel today?
Well, I would say for me it boils down to 2 points. One, make the data relevant for all stakeholders, and 2, educate about where the data comes from and how to use it, also for all stakeholder groups.
Nice and concise and to the point. I like it. It's good. It's nice and digestible. Okay, and so then maybe I'll come to you, Valeria, who's scribbling away, taking notes. Maybe some reflections you can pull out of this discussion, and how you think maybe any take-home messages you had here for how it can influence the future of your work in this area.
Well, I've heard very interesting insights in this panel, but also in the rest of the conference. So I'm quite excited. I know EIT Food does an excellent job in fostering innovation in the food systems. So I just have a feeling that, like what I said in the beginning, climate policies in the next couple of decades will have a spotlight on agriculture. And so far, there were no targets for the agricultural sector. There was no ETS for the agricultural sector, which is the case for basically now almost all other sectors. So with the new ETS for building and transports, agriculture is the only big sector left, which doesn't mean we need to have an ETS for agriculture necessarily, although we are carrying out a study about that. But the idea is, anyhow, we need a strong focus of climate policy and agriculture, and to make it bottom-up, like John was saying, so not just requirements and regulations and standards, but something that gives a tool to farmers to distinguish themselves from competitors and get a competitive advantage. They need to know where they are and what they can do. So I think there is a huge business opportunity for all these companies providing data for the farming sectors, or consultancy or advisory services, which will be exciting to see develop.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think a good note to end our panel on. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. Maybe a round of applause for our panel today.